By 1994, Sony Music believed they had Michael Jackson exactly where they wanted him. Exhausted, isolated, creatively cornered, the most powerful record label on earth had watched the world's biggest pop star stumble, and rather than extend a hand, they saw an opening. What followed was one of the most calculated acts of sabotage in music industry history, carried out not by strangers or rivals, but by the very company contractually obligated to be his partner. The man sitting in the executive chair at 550 Madison Avenue in New York had already decided, before a single note was recorded, how this story was going to go. What he did not account for was the album Michael Jackson was about to make. 20 million copies sold, a Billboard record that had never been achieved before, a music video that cost more than any in history, and Sony still engineered a way to ensure the world never fully understood what Jackson was actually saying, or who he was saying it about. The executive who decided Michael Jackson was a problem to be managed. Tommy Mottola became president of Sony Music Entertainment in 1988, and in the years that followed, he transformed the label into the most commercially dominant force in the recorded music industry. He was not a man who believed in equals. He believed in leverage, in control, and in the principle that the label, not the artist, was the ultimate authority on what success looked like. In 1993, he married Mariah Carey in a ceremony so extravagant that journalists at the time compared it to a state occasion. He had made her a star. He had made Sony indispensable to her. That was the Mottola model: create dependency, then manage it. Michael Jackson had signed his landmark deal with Sony in 1991, a contract reportedly valued at up to $1 billion across multiple albums, making it the largest recording deal in the history of the music industry. On paper, it was a partnership between the world's biggest pop star and the world's most powerful label. In practice, from the moment the ink dried, Mottola viewed Jackson as an asset to be optimized rather than an artist to be supported. Jackson was the label's most valuable commercial property, but commercial properties do not get to set their own terms. They get to perform within the terms that have been set for them. By late 1993 and into 1994, Mottola had made a private calculation. The decision he reached, in those corridors at 550 Madison, in meetings Jackson was not invited to attend, was that the smartest commercial move was not to invest aggressively in whatever new music Jackson was planning, but to extract the maximum possible value from the catalog that already existed. New music was risky. A greatest hits package was guaranteed revenue. What Mottola had essentially decided, before the first session for what would become HI Story had even been booked, was that Michael Jackson's creative future at Sony was a secondary concern. His commercial past was the asset, and that decision would shape everything that followed. The studio sessions that revealed just how alone he really was, Jackson, began recording what would become HI Story in late 1993, continuing through 1994 and into early 1995. The sessions were spread across multiple facilities in Los Angeles, Record One in Sherman Oaks, Larrabee Sound Studios in West Hollywood, and several other locations, and they bore almost no resemblance to the recording environment that had produced his greatest work. The Thriller sessions with Quincy Jones at Westlake Recording Studios in 1982 had been a model of controlled ambition, every decision deliberate, every track interrogated. Jones functioning as a creative partner who pushed Jackson toward his absolute ceiling and then pushed further. That era was over. Quincy Jones was not coming back. The partnership that had produced Off the Wall in 1979, Thriller in 1982, and Bad in 1987, three of the best-selling albums in the history of recorded music, had collapsed under the weight of public comments Jones made that Jackson considered an act of betrayal. In interviews, Jones had suggested that Jackson's creative process was more dependent on outside contributions than Jackson himself acknowledged, that the ideas, in some meaningful sense, had not always originated with the man taking the credit. For Michael Jackson, whose entire sense of himself was constructed around the belief that he was not merely a performer, but a genuine architect of his own music, those words were unforgivable. Jones was never invited back. HI Story would be the first major Jackson album in 16 years without the man who had co-produced everything and helped build the commercial and critical framework that made Jackson's dominance possible. In Jones's place came Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis. The Minneapolis production duo responsible for Janet Jackson's Control in 1986 and Rhythm Nation 1814 in 1989. Two albums that had redefined what a pop and R&B record could say and sound like. Jackson was simultaneously the artist, the producer, the creative director, and the man absorbing every piece of external pressure that was mounting around him. He was writing from a place of raw fury, and the music, track by track, showed exactly where that fury was directed. $7 million, one world record, and the silence that followed the song was co-written and produced by Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, and it addressed the media's treatment of Jackson with a directness that was unprecedented for an artist of his commercial stature. This was not subtext. This was a man looking directly at the machine that had been dismantling his reputation and refusing to look away. To a Mark Romanek, one of the most visually precise directors working in the medium at that time, a filmmaker whose aesthetic was cinematic in a way that most music video directors never achieved. The record was real, the achievement was genuine, and then the airplay simply did not follow at the level that a song with those chart credentials and that level of financial investment should have commanded. Program directors at major American radio stations were cautious. The cultural framing of Michael Jackson had been shaped by 2 years of press coverage that had already, in the minds of many gatekeepers, settled who he was and what his music was worth. Sony's promotional team, which possessed the relationships and the resources to push back against that framing with real force, did not deploy those resources with anything approaching the urgency the situation demanded. The most expensive music video ever made played, charted, and then faded in a way that no $7 million investment from any other artist on the Sony roster would ever have been permitted to do. Make sure you subscribe if you haven't already, because what Sony did next with the album structure itself makes this look minor by comparison. The greatest hits disc that was never really about the fans. HI Story, Past, Present, and Future, Book 1, was released on June 16, 1995. The packaging was presented as a gift to fans, the best of what Jackson had been, alongside the new direction he was moving in. That was the public narrative. The private reality was considerably less generous. The decision to attach a greatest hits compilation to the new studio material was not Michael Jackson's creative vision. It was a commercial strategy that served Sony's interests in ways that Jackson's interests did not fully align with. A concrete reason to buy the package anyway. It meant Sony's promotional campaign could lean on Billie Jean and Thriller, songs that required no convincing and carried no controversy, rather than committing full promotional weight to breaking 15 new tracks that would require genuine investment to reach their audience. It gave the label, in effect, a hedge. If the new music underperformed, the greatest hits would carry the commercial numbers. Sony would profit either way. Jackson's new songs, the ones he had poured everything into, the ones that carried his rage and his grief and his most direct statements about the people and institutions that had failed him, were structurally buried inside a package whose most commercially powerful element was a decade old. Stranger in Moscow had been written in a single afternoon in 1993 during the Dangerous World Tour in a Moscow hotel room where Jackson was processing a level of public exposure and personal isolation that had become almost unbearable. It was, by any serious critical measure, one of the most emotionally complete pieces of music he had ever recorded, and it was released as the sixth single from an album whose promotional energy had largely been exhausted by the time it reached the shops. The controversy that arrived at the worst possible moment, and who stayed silent in the weeks immediately following HI Story's release. A controversy erupted around one of the album's most politically charged tracks, They Don't Care About Us, that consumed the opening commercial window of the album at the precise moment when promotional momentum should have been at its peak. The song, a piece of writing about systemic injustice, about the invisibility of those the powerful choose to ignore, contained lyrics in one version that certain organizations and media figures publicly characterized as offensive. The Simon Wiesenthal Center in Los Angeles contacted Sony directly. Rabbi Marvin Here, the center's founder, called publicly for the track to be addressed. The story reached front pages within days of the album's release. Jackson's stated intention had been to use language that reflected internalized frustration, the kind of words spoken in private anger rather than directed as a public statement. He re-recorded the lines in question, a revised version was prepared and distributed. He issued a public statement. But none of that resolved the immediate damage. H.I. Story had been available for less than 3 weeks. Radio programmers who were already operating cautiously around Jackson had another reason to hesitate. Publications that might have engaged with the album's genuine artistic ambition were instead running controversy coverage. The conversation that Sony's promotional machine could have redirected, with the label's media relationships, with the weight of Mottola's industry influence, with the full infrastructure of the most powerful music company in the world, was instead allowed to run without meaningful intervention. People close to Jackson during this period noted the timing with something more than suspicion. The album's opening weeks, the window that determines chart trajectory, radio rotation, and long-term commercial positioning, were Sony's team neither anticipated publicly nor moved urgently to contain. Jackson was left to manage it alone. The label was quiet, and the album, which had entered the chart with genuine momentum, began to settle into a commercial pattern that would allow the press to write the narrative Mottola's operation had already quietly prepared. 20 million copies, and the lie they told about every single one. H.I. Story sold approximately 20 million copies worldwide. You Are Not Alone became the first single in the entire history of the Billboard Hot 100 to debut at number 1, a chart milestone that had never been achieved before Jackson did it in August 1995. Earth Song reached number 1 in the United Kingdom and stayed there for 6 weeks over Christmas 1995, becoming one of the biggest selling singles in British chart history for that year. Stranger in Moscow, released as a single in 1996, reached the top 10 across Europe. By any measurement that did not begin with the words compared to Thriller, H.I. Story was a commercial and, in places, a critical triumph. The narrative that took hold anyway, in American trade publications, in press retrospectives, in the industry conversations that shaped how the album was categorized, was one of decline. Thriller had sold 66 million copies. The Devil with a Record Deal and The War That I Story started in July 2002, 7 years after H.I. Story's release. Michael Jackson stood before cameras at a press conference in New York and said, on the record, that Tommy Mottola was a racist and a devil. He held up an image of Mottola with devil horns drawn on it. The room went silent. No artist of Jackson's stature had ever spoken about a sitting label executive in those terms, in that setting, with that specificity. It was not a moment of lost composure. It was a prepared statement, delivered deliberately, by a man who had been building toward it for the better part of a decade. The roots of that moment were in H.I. Story, in the sessions that Jackson navigated without Quincy Jones, in the double album structure he did not choose, in the $7 million video that radio did not play. Every humiliation, every silence from 550 Madison Avenue, every promotional decision that prioritized the label's short-term revenue over the long-term integrity of his new work. Jackson had recorded all of it, processed all of it, and then put all of it into 15 songs that most of the people who bought the album never fully understood were addressed to a specific person sitting in a specific office. He never fully got the chance. But H.I. Story remains. Every track of Disc 2, every lyric of Scream and Earth Song and Stranger in Moscow, as the clearest, most direct statement he ever made about the industry that built him and the specific men inside it who had decided, somewhere along the way, that owning him was more valuable than supporting him.